My name is Jennifer Catman. I teach sociology here at Sierra College, and I also serve as chair of the New Legacy Committee, which is one of the supporters of this event. I want to welcome all of you to the 7th annual Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series. Before we get to our great event, I want to cover some housekeeping items. In the event of an emergency, please take time to locate your nearest exit. We have 2 up front here. I'm the flight attendant. 2 up front here, 2 where you came in from out back. So please be aware of that in the event we need to evacuate. I want to take some time to thank the sponsors for today's events, the Associated Students of Sierra College. Give them a big round of applause. And our Equal Employment Opportunity Committee here at Sierra College. Thank you very much. And at this time, I want to turn the microphone over to the organizer of this event and my esteemed colleague, Dr. Reyes Ortega.
Good morning. Buenos dias. I heard that somewhere over here. Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you so very much for attending this year's Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series. Today actually marks the birthday of Cesar Chavez, and in all sincerity, I can tell you that he would be humbled to know of your interest to attend our event in honor of his legacy to achieve social justice and equity. My name is Dr. Reyes Ortega, and as you heard earlier, welcome to the 7th annual Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series at Sierra College. You have programs in your hands where information is provided that describes the endurance, sacrifice, and life given by Cesar Chavez to promote a philosophy of nonviolence as a means to unravel generations of institutional barriers, institutional racism, and the unfortunate consequence of social inequities. His practice was one of respect, collaboration, negotiation, and compromise. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to thank you once again and to share my honor by introducing our esteemed guests for today's event. Please join me as I welcome Professor Omar M. Dajani, Professor of Law at the University of the Pacific. And at this time also, if I could please welcome Rabbi Michael Lerner with the Beit Tikkun Synagogue, author and recipient of the Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi Peace Award. Please welcome. Thank you. Before I introduce our moderator, I do want to take a quick moment to thank a couple of the other organizers for today's event. And it's a little difficult for me to see. Oh, here we go. Right here in the front, our history professor, Professor Ralph de Unamuno, if you could stand, please. And one of our esteemed administrators now would be Mr. Chris Yatuma. Thank you both very, very much. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, our very own, the Sierra College, Dr. Matt Archer, Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the Anthropology Department.
Very enthusiastic group here.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to the event. It's wonderful to see you here. Before we get started, I'd just like to say what a privilege and an honor it is to be on the stage with 2 wonderful peace activists. Your record and your commitment to peace in general, and particularly on this issue with Israel and Palestine, is obviously impressive and notable, and I just feel really honored to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. So to get us started, here at Sierra College, we envision ourselves as a collaborative campus. And we, when we have, a difficult decision or a conflict, we try to, use a process, like interest-based bargaining type of a process to really resolve that. And what that means is, the process is basically we identify stakeholders, we get them together to talk about their interests. We try to identify where the interests overlap, where they diverge. And then through a process of conversation, we try to identify common ground and find ways to move forward that are mutually agreeable for all the parties involved. So do you think you can help us think about the conflict between Palestine and Israel in a way that resonates with that approach? Who are the stakeholders? What are the interests involved? Where do they overlap? Where do they diverge? And how can, through that kind of a conversation, can we help to maybe get a little bit better understanding about, why this conflict exists and persists?
Would you start?
Please. Thank you. We're like Barack and Arafat. First of all, I just want to say what a tremendous honor it is to be here, not just to be able to share the stage with you, Rabbi, and as I mentioned in my email correspondence, you're someone whom my father very greatly admired, so it's very special for me to be able to have a conversation with you, but also with you, Matt, and to be a part of a speaker series that bears Cesar Chavez's name. He is such a towering figure with respect to the search for justice, so it's a very great honor in that respect as well. Maybe I might start off by saying, and we'll talk a little bit more about the history of this conflict as we proceed, and of course this is something that could fill quite a few sessions as opposed to one, so concision, being brief, is difficult. But before we get to the history, maybe I'll start by talking a little bit about the ways that Palestinians tend to understand their own interests in the context of this conflict. And then perhaps give Rabbi Lerner an opportunity to talk a bit about Israelis and maybe also some of the problems with an interest-based approach to resolving the conflict. So, as you'll see when we talk about the history of this conflict, when we refer to Palestinians, we're actually referring to a group that is itself quite diverse, that is scattered and has within the group an array of different interests. And so, as you'll see from the maps shortly, there are Palestinians who live inside the state of Israel. There are Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which are two territories adjacent to Israel that were conquered by Israel during the 1967 war. More about that later. And on top of that, you've got Palestinians who are living in diaspora, i.e. outside of Palestine and Israel. Many of those, including myself, are the descendants of refugees who fled or were expelled from their homes in what is now Israel during the civil war that unfolded there in 1948. And those refugees live in Lebanon, they live in Syria, Jordan, primarily, but also much further afield in Iraq, and as it turns out, in Northern California. So when we talk about Palestinians' interests, of course, they're diverse and sometimes even disparate. Now, I would boil down how Palestinians understand their interests to three things, though certainly Palestinians may have a diversity of views about it. And those three things are, I think, number one, security, number two, liberty or freedom, and number three, identity. And what do I mean by that? So, with respect to security, and I think that this is an interest that both Palestinians and Israelis feel very strongly about. For Palestinians, to be secure means not living under a foreign military occupation. And so in the West Bank and Gaza Strip for next year, by next year, for 50 years, Palestinians will have lived under Israeli military rule. And what that means to Palestinians is that their children very often can't go to school without passing Israeli soldiers or Israeli settlers, and we'll talk about who they are later on. Palestinians may not be able to go and worship in a mosque or in a church. Palestinians are both Christian and Muslim. in Jerusalem without getting their capital city, without getting a permit from Israeli authorities to move. They may not be able to go to the airport and take a vacation without getting a permit to go to the airport, a permit which may be denied. And on top of that, they live more broadly within a context that leaves them feeling very insecure. Soldiers in their midst, land being confiscated regularly, and with the sense that at any moment their lives could fly very far outside of their control. And so for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, security looms very large, but it also looms large for Palestinian refugees. And I'll just give you one example on this front. A Palestinian whose family fled or was expelled from the north of what is now Israel and made its way to Syria in 1948-49, as my family ultimately did, and that remained in Syria for all of these years, would find itself in a terrible predicament, not having only been made refugees once in 1948 and never managed to become citizens of another country, of Syria, which treated Palestinians well for some time but didn't give them citizenship. They were, after all, from another country. But now, in the context of this horrific civil war unfolding in Syria, many of these Palestinians find themselves refugees a second time and blocked from going to other places. And so for Palestinians, their interest in security as refugees is also an interest that is about being in a place where that they can call home, and feeling some confidence that they'll be able to pursue their lives in freedom. Second point, I'm sorry, I promise not to go on for too long.
Go on. Take your time.
So, thank you, Rabbi. So I think a second interest important to Palestinians is freedom. And this is again where the experience of occupation looms so large. Palestinians who live in Israel, for the most part, are citizens of the state of Israel and have the right to vote. And that's about 20% of the population of Israel and more than 1 million Palestinians. But for the more than 3 million Palestinians, 3 to 4 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip under Israeli military occupation, they don't have the right to vote in Israeli elections. They don't have the right to chart their fate. Although there is such a thing as the Palestinian Authority, which is kind of like a municipal government, akin to the government that runs things in City Hall in Sacramento or here in Rockland. It provides for police services, it collects the trash, and deals with development issues. But what it can't do is enter into a binding trade agreement with another country that is responsive to the particular interests and concerns of Palestinians. What it can't do is to, as we did here in California, decide that there will be a high-speed rail connecting the city of Jenin in the far north of the West Bank with the city of Hebron in the south, which is something that a think tank in California urged the Palestinians and Israelis to agree on, and that would be great for Palestinian development. The Palestinian Authority lacks the ability to take a step like that. In a range of contexts with respect to a whole array of issues, Palestinians lack the freedom to take decisions for themselves. Those decisions instead are taken by a foreign military power. The third interest that I want to highlight is identity, and it's related to the other two, but it's complex in its own way. And so for Palestinians, being able to choose and to affirm their identity is in part about being able to hold a passport that says, I'm a Palestinian, and travel with it abroad. It's in part about being able to decide on the educational curriculum without external interference that their children will learn, that will be taught in their schools, and to ensure that kids across the length and breadth of their territory understand the history of their own people, something that is near and dear to, I suspect, many people in this room as well. But in addition to those things, and being able to determine a foreign policy that connects Palestine to the other countries that it feels an affinity with, in addition to those kinds of things, identity in this part of the world is also very wrapped up in territory. And I want to end on this point. For both Palestinians, whether they're Israeli citizens or living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and for Israeli Jews, there is a profound attachment to the land. Speaking for Palestinians for a moment, you know, my family has lived in the city of Jaffa, which is just south of the modern city of Tel Aviv, in what is now Israel, for hundreds of years. It's lived in Palestine, this territory, for hundreds of years before that. Our family tree goes back 1,200 years. We have a profound sense of attachment to places that are wrapped up in our family's history, to Jaffa, to Jerusalem, to the lands outside of those cities, to the orange groves that were there. They're a part of our family stories, they're a part of our poetry, they're a part of our culture. And so for many Palestinians to be wrenched away from these places that are dear to them, because as refugees they're denied the opportunity to return to a place like Jaffa, or because as residents of the West Bank they're not permitted to travel to the Gaza Strip or vice versa, that not only affects their convenience, it affects their very ability to determine who they are and to express who they are. And so I think one of the challenges in this conflict is that whereas my sense is that the parties' respective claims to security and to freedom are very significantly compatible, and I think that there's even room to reach an accommodation with respect to enabling both of them to realize their identity in this land that they share. It becomes very complicated and difficult when the attachments of both peoples run to similar or the same parts of the land. And with that, let me let the rabbi speak.
Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
And I think I agree with almost everything you say. So I'll try to, it's a little harder to tell it from the Jewish standpoint because our attachment to the land goes back 3,200 years or so. And certainly the relevant part begins with the expulsion of the Jews from our ancient homeland by the Romans in the period that Rome had conquered Judea, and particularly starting from 70 of the contemporary or Christian era, when the Romans burnt down the temple, to 135 of the current era, when the Romans killed hundreds of thousands of Jews who were either suspected of participating in a rebellion against Roman rule. And Jews were, from that point on, from about 135 of the Common Era, were forced to live in other places where the security wasn't there. Why wasn't there security? Well, first of all, when Christianity became the dominant religion of Rome in the around 325 of the Christian era or the contemporary era, the Christian church began to teach hatred of Jews. And this became a central part of the doctrine of the Catholic Church for right up until the Vatican Council II that took place in the 1960s. So the Christian Church was teaching that the Jews were, as a collective body, not the Jews who lived at the time of Jesus, but all Jews throughout all of history were responsible for killing the Son of God. And this led to a reality in which Jews in Christian countries where we were living we're living in either Europe or in Muslim countries. But in Christian countries where we were living, every Easter, there were many cities where Christians would come into the Jewish quarters, where Jews were forced to live in restricted areas called ghettos. That's where that term ghetto comes from. And would come and try to assault Jews, burn down their houses, kill Jews every Easter, usually starting around Good Friday that weekend. And Jews were kept from having any rights in the society, kept out of almost all professions. So for a very long period of time, Jews were under assault in the Christian world. I contrast that with the Muslim world because in the Muslim world, Jews, luckily for us, nobody claimed that Jews killed Muhammad. So in the Islamic world, we lived as second-class citizens. We lived in conditions essentially similar to apartheid. That is, there were specific areas Jews were supposed to live in. There were Jews were required to wear some kind of symbol indicating that they were Jewish. Jews were prohibited from riding a horse in many of those countries. There were periodic outbreaks against Jews, but it wasn't like every Good Friday. Or it was there were different times when there were violence against Jews. But it wasn't core to Islamic belief. So Jews were in a better situation in Islamic countries, although still as living in conditions of unequal rights for most of the history. So you can imagine how excited Jews became when the old feudal order, the order that the time in which the society was organized on inherited land and Jews were not allowed to own land. When the feudal order started to be overturned by the new capitalist order. And the capitalist order promised, particularly in the manifestation of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, of liberty, fraternity, equality for all. And so so this only happened in the 19th century. Okay, it seems like it might be for many of us here a long time ago, right? It's 150 years ago, 200 years ago. But until 150 years ago to 200 years ago, most Jews were living in areas that were prescribed as the only areas that they could live. It was only as a result of the revolutions of 1848 and 1871 that Jews were let out of the ghettos, let out of the areas that had been prescribed as the only place where Jews could live. And so Jews were very hopeful about what could happen. But there was something else that was going on at the same time. Because with the capitalist order emerged, there also emerged a new situation for most of the peasants who lived on the land, which was that they were forced off the land. The land became privatized as a commodity, no longer inherited, and people were pushed into the cities where the only way they could survive was to work for large capitalist firms, and those capitalist firms were largely exploiting them. And I don't mean exploiting at the level that they do today. I mean at the level in which people were dying very, very young because of the pollution and because of the lack of health and sanitary conditions in the big cities and so forth. So there began to be rebellions against the capitalist order. And the capitalists responded to that by saying, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with the upset that people have? And one of the traditional answers that ruling elites have when the people are unhappy is to say, the reason you should be unhappy is because there is some evil other out there that is taking from you or is hurting you or is responsible for this. Now, you know how that is playing out today in America, right? You know that we have people who are saying, the problems for Americans living here is those Mexicans who are coming, or the refugees who are coming. these are, and we've had a number of traditional demeaned others in our society, African Americans, Native Americans, systematically discriminated against for a long time. And the anger that people might have at being oppressed, being unhappy in their society, gets directed at these evil others. But the primary evil other in Europe was the Jews. Why the Jews? Because when the national entities were looking for somebody to blame for what wasn't going on right, they had already 1,500 to 1,600 years worth of their population having been indoctrinated into hating the Jews. So the Jews were the easiest target to say. It wasn't the only target, and eventually it also became gays and lesbians, and it also became gypsies and so forth, but primarily it was the Jews. This created tremendous upset amongst Jews, and many of whom felt like, okay, we thought this was going to be our, once Christianity was no longer the legal shaper of the society, once we were supposedly free to determine our fate, we could live in equality with people. They said liberty, equality, and fraternity, but they're actually turned against us. And so many Jews tried to leave Europe. Most of them came first they went from Eastern Europe to France, Germany, and to England, but many came to the United States, to Argentina, to South Africa, to Australia, and looking for some way away from this oppression and this growing hatred that was now turned against them. Now I'm talking about the time, if you know any Jews, if any of you know any Jewish people, and you ask them about their grandparents or their great-grandparents came to this country between 1880 and 1920. Why only till 1920? Because in 1920, the United States started to shut its doors to refugees and passed in 1924, the McCarran-Walters Act that prohibited people from Eastern Europe from coming to this country. But in that period, most came to these countries in the West. A small group of them, however, decided that we should go back to our ancient homeland, and they called themselves Zionists. They said, why don't we recreate a Jewish society there, a homeland for us there? And they went there often with a supposition of, well, this is a land without people for a people without land. However, it turned out there was a people there, namely the Arab peoples. Now, the Arab peoples at this point in, say, 1880 to 1920, did not primarily identify as Palestinians. They saw themselves as part of the Arab nation, which was of much of the Middle East. But there were a small group of people who were simultaneously developing a Palestinian national identity. So when Jews went there in that first period, they were not greeted with open arms. There was resistance to their coming, and the resistance in part came from the absentee landlords who were influencing the Palestinian people through the mosques that they controlled. And they were teaching people that these people are coming to take your land. They're coming to destroy you. They're coming to overturn your society here. Whereas from the standpoint, this was not actually the case. This was not the case that most of the Jews, we're talking now about a few thousand Jews. We're not until 1905, just a few thousand Jews. After that, larger numbers of Jews starting to come there. But they're coming there as a small minority, and they're finding themselves being demeaned by the people who live there. And the demeaning comes from not from something in the heart of Arabs, but rather from the teachings that they're getting in the mosques that are shaped by absentee landlords who are saying, these are your enemies. Now, why did the absentee landlords want to see them as enemies? Because these people, they felt, were bringing capitalist values to a feudal society. And all the worse when they realized that many of those who came to this early Zionist movement were socialists, didn't believe even in private property. And the absentee landlords were very, very threatened by that. Anyway, so we have a development of people coming back to their ancient homeland and feeling the resistance to that. As a result, some Jews started to turn to the existing colonial. Well, all right. Now, one other thing to say about the resistance: the Arabs who resisted Jews coming there and hearing the story that Jews wanted to take over, and being told that they were part of the colonial enterprise, they had some basis for fear of Europeans coming. Because what was happening simultaneously at this moment was that the European powers, particularly England and France, were colonizing most of the Middle East, North Africa, and a lot of South Asia. So there was a lot of reason to fear Europeans coming. But on the other hand, there was these Jews who, when they heard this story, said, "Are you kidding? We're coming to represent European colonialism? We're coming to run away from European colonialism. We are the people who have been oppressed for 1,700 years. We thought finally these Europeans would let us be equal. They're not letting us be equal. So we're running away, and the Arabs here are saying to us, you're coming as representatives of the colonialism there." So instead of trying to reach out to the people there, however, the Jews did not think, okay, well, let's tell our story to the Palestinian people. Let's try to find a way to explain what we want, because what we want is a homeland. We don't necessarily want to expel anybody. But instead, what happened was that many of the Jews said, there's no point in this. The reason why we need a homeland, so this is all about your first point of security. Why do we need a homeland? We need a homeland because the non-Jews, the Goyim, they hate us wherever we go. That's been our history for the last 1,700 years. We don't need an explanation of why these people hate us. Everybody seems to treat us as though they hate us. So, and breaking through that, no way. And so a section of this Zionist movement started to say, they're right, we maybe need to. We need to have land for ourselves, and we may need to create a state here instead of just a homeland here. And some of those people who thought, okay, we'll need to create a state here, tried to convince the European governments, particularly England, that had been, after the First World War, given the right to a mandate over Palestine, to convince them to allow a Jewish state to emerge in Palestine. And so the Balfour Declaration that was given at the end of the First World War said, His Majesty's government recognizes the right of the Jewish people to a homeland in Palestine. Now, that became the basis for Jews thinking that, okay, this is going to be the place where we might be able to create some safety for ourselves. But that safety looked, to the standpoint of Palestinians, looked like, wait a second, who are the British to give them the right to move here? The British only control this area because of their power, not because of some right that they have. Whereas the Jews were saying, well, the people who the League of Nations have given the right to have this, to run this area, the British, are telling us we have a right to come here. So people started to come there, in part to escape what was then happening in the 1920s and 1930s, namely the growth of Nazism in Europe. And with the growth of Nazism in Europe and fascist movements, for example, in the United States, in this very country, there was a fascist movement and led by people who were saying, we hate the Jews. The Jews are the real reason for the depression of the 1930s. It's the Jews have caused all the problems. So more and more Jews thinking, maybe we need a place to escape to. Maybe we really do. Meanwhile, elements of the Palestinian leadership were saying, no, you can't come here. And we're beginning to convince the other Arab states around that they should use their economic power with oil to say to the British and French, if you want our oil, should you be engaged in a struggle against Germany and its fascist regime, you've got to keep the Jews out of here. And so eventually, they prevailed, and Britain imposed an embargo on Jews going there. Now, this embargo, or this prevention of Jews coming to Palestine, was at a time when the United States was not accepting any immigrants from Europe. It was saying, no, you can't come here, or almost no immigrants from Europe. And Jews were eventually, in the Second World War, during what became known as the Holocaust, try to get this. 1 out of every 3 Jews alive in 1939 was murdered between 1939 and 1945. 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world, okay? So try to imagine what a trauma that was. And they were experiencing the Palestinian people as saying, your ancient homeland, where you wanted to have a homeland, you can't come here. You're not allowed to come here. And the British, acting from the pressure from the Arab world, succeeded in turning back boats that eventually sunk in the ocean. Jews were turned away from our shores as well. So security for Jews became a central issue. Okay, if you've had your people have 1 out of every 3 people murdered, well, you have an incredible trauma. And that incredible trauma was then met by Jews saying, then we're going to create our state here. And there was a civil war that took place, or a war that took place between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. And that war was supplemented by surrounding Arab states attacking Israel in 1948. From the standpoint of Jews, thank God we were able to create a state for ourselves. But from the standpoint of Palestinians, this same reality in 1948 became a tragedy. And it became a tragedy because the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who had fled from their homes to avoid the war, but understand that from the standpoint of the Jews, if they were going to flee, there was no place to flee to. Whereas there were 100 million Arabs in the surrounding states, there was no other place where it was a Jewish state. So people fled from their homes. Now, did they flee from their homes? Why did they flee from their homes? Well, some for looking for security, but a significant number were fled from their homes because there was a right-wing Jewish underground that was attacking Palestinian villages, and in some cases massacring Palestinians, and massacring Palestinians who wanted to live in peace with the new Jewish state, precisely to give the message, you have to flee, get out of here, we don't want you here. So there's a tremendous tragedy for the Palestinian people, the Nakba, and it becomes for the Palestinian people an equal moment of tragedy and hurt and pain as the Holocaust had been for us. Here we get a state then created, and from my standpoint, from this point on, one horrible thing happens after another to the Jewish state, namely that the fear element becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And as Palestinians strive to come back to their homeland, their own homeland, as you so brilliantly put it, attached to the same land that these Jews are attached to, the Israelis grow more and more fearful that they will be pushed out, particularly after running up to the 1967 war, in which both Syria and Egypt are putting out propaganda saying, we are going to push these Jews into the sea. Now, imagine that you've just lost 1/3 of your people through another madman and a mad society that's killing them all off. And then these surrounding states are saying, we're going to do that to you again. We're going to wipe you out again. Now, so from the standpoint of the Jewish people, luckily that didn't happen, and that Israel did a first strike to wipe out the potential danger. But from that standpoint on, Jews have felt like we have to defend Israel at all costs. And all costs has been, from my standpoint, a tragedy for Palestinians and a tragedy for the Jewish people. Because in moving in that direction, we moved further and further towards the most right-wing possible, the most nationalist, the most ultra-nationalist, the most militarist solutions to the Palestinian people. And our hearts were not adequately open to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, simultaneously, it was very hard for Palestinians to have their hearts open to our people and our suffering when we had created this reality for so many hundreds of thousands of people now living in these refugee camps. And so from my standpoint, there's a huge amount of objective interests that coincide between Israel and Palestine. And if people could act rationally, they would I mean, I've written a book that we're going to have on sale that lays out a strategy for what it would look like to have these two people living in peace. But unfortunately, neither people, in my view, are responding to their own rational self-interest. Instead, both people are dominated by the post-traumatic stress disorder. We call it PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, in which it's so hard to see the humanity of the other. And instead, they see only all those acts of the other that feel threatening. One last thing, and then I'll stop here. That account would be great if it were the total picture. But there's another element of the picture that has to be affirmed by those of us. I'm one of those who loves Israel, but I also love Palestine. I want both of these people. I care about both of these people, and I want both of them to be reconciled and live in peace. And I think it's totally possible. But what stands in the way is that they're not acting as rational agents. They're acting as traumatized peoples. And that trauma is one which is so deep in both people that from my standpoint, the most important thing that we can do at the first step is to try to heal the pain that both people feel. But the pain is in a context of unequal power. Israel has vastly more power than the Palestinian people. And yet when you listen to American politicians, they talk as though Israel is about to be destroyed and we have to all get behind it and protect it, without any sense of responsibility for trying to push Israel to act in a caring way towards the Palestinian people. And that inequality of power makes it all the more difficult to overcome the post-traumatic stress disorder and hence to overcome the feelings of insecurity that dominate the Jewish people. I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much. That was very helpful for me. And one of the things that I think, as you mentioned, that came to my mind immediately is that's really how similar the underlying interests are. Right? And as you put it, with security and liberty and identity, in some sense, really basic sort of interests with regards to the Palestinians and Israelis. And it sort of seems like the way you're framing it, that really there's a series of historical misunderstandings and the inability to really see things from the other's perspective. And I'm wondering, so if we could look maybe through some of the history with regards to, and you've already raised some interesting points, but look into some of the historical moments, some of those key moments where there were incidents that are really important to understand in terms of the conversation, but also then discussing how those historical moments are conceptualized from different perspectives.
Great. Thanks very much, Rabbi and Matt. Like you, I would agree with much of what you laid out. There are a few things I might quibble with, but maybe it makes sense to talk about them in the context of the broader historical narrative. And I wanted to just make 2 points to sort of structure this narrative, which I will try to keep concise. The 2 points are, number one, that while there is a widespread conception of this conflict as an age-old conflict from time immemorial that touches deep religious passions and hatreds. That's not the case, and I think you would agree with that, Rabbi. This is a conflict that's about a century old, which is not a short time by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not thousands of years old, and that, I think, should give us some hope, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And the second point that I want to make which I'll also try to bear out, is that in this context, in this part of the world, like in any part of the world, identity is to some extent dynamic. The way in which people saw themselves over time has changed. And so let me just try to sort of take you through a few maps, if I may, because I find maps to be a useful way of thinking about this story. And I want to just start off with the map that you see up here on the screen, which just provides you with a glimpse of the broad, oh, sorry, that's not what you see on the screen at all. So we're going to go back here, up. Okay, so what you see here on the right is a map of the broader Middle East. And then on the left, we see the state of Israel, and then the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which you can see marked off in stripes. And then the neighboring states of Jordan and Egypt, and then Syria to the top, and Lebanon to the immediate north. And so the striped areas are the areas that Israel occupied in 1967. More on that in a little bit. So this gives you just a sense of where we are in the world. Now, the next thing that I want you to have a sense of is the scale. When we talk about Israel and Palestine, we're not talking about big countries. On the left, you see the West Bank and Gaza Strip. On the right, according to the same scale, the San Francisco Bay Area. Okay? So I want you to get a sense of how small the space we're talking about is, right? This is not much bigger than, actually, it's quite a bit smaller than Northern California, much less California itself, okay? Now, let me just talk through the first point that I wanted to make, which is that while this is an ancient land, and while this conflict in some respects has roots in things that happened many years ago, it's not an ancient conflict. So what you see up here is a glimpse of the Holy Land, as we like to call it, as of the 9th century before the Common Era. And what you see on the screen there is a range of kingdoms/states. And what I want to highlight to you is two things. Number one, that there has been a Jewish presence in this land for millennia, and that is beyond controversy. And indeed, there was for around 200 years, if I'm right, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel existed in this space, and there has been a continuous Jewish presence since that time. But there has also been the presence of other peoples across this land throughout that time, peoples whose names are familiar to us from the Bible, including the Philistines. Now, one of the points that I made a moment ago about identity being dynamic comes into play here. When we look at Rabbi Lerner and myself and we say, okay, trace your roots back, it's very difficult to say, yes, Omar is Palestinian. He must originally have been a Philistine. Rabbi Lerner is Jewish. He must originally be a descendant of those who were part of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And the real story is much more complicated than that. This was a place where, over time, there was tremendous intermixing. One Israeli historian, Shlomo Sands, has argued that many of the Jews who lived in this area into the 7th century, which I'll get to in a moment, ended up converting to Islam. And ironically and perhaps tangentially, I recently did one of these National Geographic Genome Project things where you swab the side of your cheek to see where your ancestors came from. And what was striking about the results was, that it's no secret that my father's side came to a great extent from this area, and that my mother's side is linked to a small sect in Syria. Those things came out. But what also came out was that my family has very much genetically in common with Ashkenazi Jews. What that points to is the fact that this identity that we cling to, Palestinian Jewish or Palestinian Israeli, is an identity that in some respects a 20th century identity. It used to be possible to say that someone was an Arab Jew, And it used to be possible to say that someone was a Palestinian Jew. And so we have to be expansive in our understanding of these things. Sorry, that was a long tangent. So we see that there was a Jewish presence from all the way back the 9th century and well before that, one suspects. And that continued. But what we also see in this part of the world is waves of invasion. What we now know as Israel and Palestine was previously part of many empires. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the first Muslim empire, the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th century, 8th century, and then subsequent Muslim caliphates. And then a few hundred years later, it became a part of what ultimately was known as the Ottoman Empire, which continued all the way until the beginning of the 20th century. And so in this context, we've got waves of invasion and also, to a very great extent, significant mixing among the populations. Now, I said this is not an ancient conflict. So when does it come to pass? And it comes to pass to a great extent at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And Rabbi Lerner laid out some of this story. I just want to quibble with one thing, which is to say that while Palestinian identity as such is a relatively new phenomenon, Palestinians, what we now think of as Palestinians, someone from Jaffa or from Bethlehem, might not have called him or herself a Palestinian in 1880, for example. But they probably wouldn't have called themselves an Arab either. They would have called themselves a Bethlehemite or a Jerusalemite. What mattered to them, to a very significant extent, was that local identity and maybe also a broader religious identity, being Muslim or being Christian or being Jewish. Now, by the period between 1880 and 1920, when nationalism, which I suspect many of you have studied, begins to take hold all across the world, not just in Europe, then these other kinds of identities, Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, Jewish nationalism, also known as Zionism, become more significant to people, and they define their identity in those terms. So, not an ancient conflict, but a conflict very much fed, as Rabbi Lerner said, by not only competing dreams on the parts of these peoples, but also competing machinations by third parties. Following World War I, Turkey is the loser, or the Ottoman Empire is one of the losers. It was on the wrong side of that war. And its lands get taken over by the Allied powers from the First World War. And one of those Allied powers, Britain, assumes for itself the role of managing what's going to happen in Palestine, which had been a province or a pair of provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Now, it's important to just get a little bit of a sense of the demography at this point in time. And this looms very large for Palestinians. And I want to emphasize at this moment that in going back and talking about who was there at a particular moment in time, what I'm not arguing is that there's not a place for Jews or for Israelis in this space, but instead trying to help you to understand why Palestinians felt the injustice that Rabbi Lerner so articulately described earlier. So if you look at this first point on the graph, 1914, what you see in green is the Palestinian population, i.e. Muslims and Christians living in Palestine at that juncture, and then in blue is the Jewish population at that point in time. Now, during the years that follow, you see the Jewish population rising fairly slowly until we get into the years where things get really rough in Europe, right? And Rabbi Lerner pointed to the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust, but even in the 1930s, the writing was on the wall to some extent. So we begin to see more migration. But the point I want you to understand is that at the beginning of the 20th century, Palestinians understood Palestine to be their country, their space. And even if Jews understood what they were doing was coming back to their ancient homeland, Palestinians looked to them and said, well, who are you? What gives you a right to enter our country, to buy land out from under us? And that might be the only second point I would quibble about a little bit. While the first Jews who came to Palestine as part of what was called the first Aliyah, the first return to the ancient land of Israel, made a very significant effort to connect with the local population. Some of their successors by the late 1800s were making less of an effort, and to some extent also refusing to allow land that had been purchased by Jews to be resold to non-Jews, or to allow land that had been purchased by Jews to be worked by non-Jews. And so for Palestinians, this was a further source of anger. They're moving in, they're buying land out from under us, and they're not letting us work on land that we have farmed for centuries. So these demographic dynamics, we're the majority, and these power dynamics, what are you doing with your economic power, culminate to create a sense of conflict. Now, the rabbi has already sort of pointed out the simultaneous story, and here you see on the screen Theodor Herzl, who was a Swiss Jew who, at the end of the 19th century, wrote a very influential pamphlet called The Jewish State, in which he argued, in essence, as long as we Jews are a minority somewhere, everywhere, we're always going to face persecution. Why? Because minorities face persecution, and Jews have historically also always been a focus, always been a scapegoat. Now, there were a few places that were contemplated as a place where this Jewish state might be. But when Palestinians, which I'll call them now, even if we understand that that's in some ways a 20th century designation, were concerned about this. One very prominent Palestinian who had been part of the Ottoman government, Yusuf al-Khalidi, wrote to the chief rabbi of France, who passed on the message to Herzl, saying, for God's sake, let it not be Palestine. Let Palestine be left alone. We understand that you want a homeland for yourselves, but can it please not be our space? There are already people here. Now, you've heard a bit more about the history. You've heard about the Balfour Declaration, in which the British say that they support the creation of a Jewish national home in what was Palestine. What those words, national home, mean are subject to some argument. And that causes the Palestinians to be even more angry. They say, okay, now the British are in charge. They've taken over from the Turks, and they're still not giving us a chance to rule ourselves. They want to create a national home for another people in our land. And by the late 1940s, as the conflict between Palestinians, who remain by far the majority in this area, and the waves of Jewish migrants, as well as the Jews who had been there previously, begins to rage, the British government does what the British are so expert at doing. They wash their hands of the whole story and say, here, it's yours, to the United Nations. And the United Nations sets out a partition plan, says, you know what? The way in which we're going to deal with this problem, two peoples, one land, is we're going to split it up. Now, on both sides, there was some uncertainty about whether to embrace this scheme. For many Jews, this was less than all and was not a great solution, but the Jewish leadership embraced it because something was better than nothing. Palestinians, on the other hand, said, wait a minute. If we look at our land ownership, which is represented in green, sorry, I'm taking too long. We got to get to questions. So if we look at our land ownership, we own the vast majority of the land here. We're still the majority of the people. We reject this. War breaks out, and then when the dust settles, the new state of Israel is created, covering 78% of what had been Palestine. and West Bank is under Jordanian rule, Gaza Strip is under Egyptian rule, and then in 1967 we see Israel conquering the rest. I should stop here because I'm going on for too long. Or do you want me to finish up the...
Why don't you finish up the music?
Okay, let me just...
So we don't-
I'm sorry, everyone.
1967, maybe.
Let me just say yeah, sorry. Okay. So I just want to mention the last part of the story, which is that in 1993, Palestinians and Israelis get together and shake hands on the White House lawn and conclude an agreement that's going to provide a framework for negotiating peace between them. And the framework provides that until peace is agreed, until the terms of peace are agreed, there's going to be some degree of Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. But not all across the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Instead, the West Bank and Gaza Strip are divided up into pieces. And the Palestinians are given full rule over the areas that you see marked in red, which come to be known as Areas A. They're given partial rule over the areas in gray, and the rest remained and remains under full Israeli control. And this jurisdictional scheme, to a great extent, remains in place. The only and last thing that I want to add here, in view of the time, is that at the same time that Palestinians rule over parts of this land, Israel, since occupying it in 1967, has, in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is a treaty that governs how people are supposed to act in war, has been settling Israeli Jews in the same territory. And you can see marked in yellow what those settlements look like territorially. And you can see in the photograph that when we talk about settlements, they're not tents. They're big buildings that look like subdivisions. And so one of the biggest issues to grapple with as we try to move forward is what to do with the 500,000 to 600,000 Israelis that now live in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, going forward toward a peace agreement. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. That's wonderful. Thank you. Rabbi Leonard, you wanted a brief moment to respond, and then we'll move to some questions.
To questions, so I'll just make two little points. One is that you should know that a significant section of American Jews and Israeli Jews oppose those settlements.
Sure.
And want Israel to be strong and believe that the best way for Israel to be strong is to have a peace arrangement with the Palestinian people and and either the end of settlements or some other solution. I have another solution I'll talk to either in the next session or whatever. The second thing I want to say is you're hearing, there's a part of your story, which, I mean, most of which I agree with, but there's one part that I would say is more problematic than the way you present it, which is if you could go back to that picture of the percentage of people living.
Sure.
You know, the one with the
this one?
percentages.
This one or?
No, the one before that.
Yeah.
Yeah, here. So here you're seeing the percentage of Jews to percentage of Arabs in these lands. And finally, in 1948, you have a struggle between these two peoples. The majority are Arabs, the minority are Jews, and the Arabs, the Palestinians call for support from surrounding 8 other nations. You saw the tininess of Israel compared to the hugeness of all these other nation states. Just imagine, every analogy is weak, and but I want to ask you, doesn't this sound familiar? This is a minority group who is and the majority that are saying, who are these people that are coming here? What business do they have here? For me, this has resonances with Trump and with the majority hatred of particularly of people coming from Mexico and coming from South America here to this country. The majority are saying, hey, we're white Protestants or we're white Christians. We built this society ourselves. And now these people are coming, and they're coming for jobs for us. They're going to take jobs away from us. And who are they? What right do they have to be here? I'm not on their side. I'm not on the side of the white majority or the white people in this country who are saying, and yes, they have a case. They lived here first. They built the society. They did it by destroying the Native American population here, just as Muslims actually got that power in much of the Muslim world in part through force and violence, not through, hey, we have a better argument than you guys about your religion, but because there was a forcible takeover by Islam in the 8th and 9th century, 10th century. Here you've got a majority saying to this minority that is, as I said before, a desperate minority, desperate for some place to be, just as those coming to the United States today from South America are economically desperate, in large part because of what the United States did in its trade policies with Latin America. We wiped out the ability of many people in South and Central America to make a living there under the Clinton agreements and the Clinton trade policies and so forth. They're coming here, and the majority is saying, you have no right to be here. This is what leads me to have as my core position, okay, because I am not a Zionist. I am a religious Jew, okay? And although I understand and understand the Zionist movement and recognize it as a legitimate national liberation struggle, from my standpoint, the problem really is nationalism itself, and that we need to overcome looking at the world that way. So as I'll say, I guess in the book thing, I'll talk a little bit about my solution is a no-state solution. Because I think it's time to get over all these national boundary issues and create a different organization of the world based on environmental districts, because the main problem facing our world today is saving the environment, and instead we've got all our attention on these ridiculous national struggles going on.
I can just say one thing on that front. Okay. So I like you, I'm a skeptic when it comes to nationalism and the modern state. So I suspect we might end up having similar views about the best solution here. But the metaphor I think that you offer is problematic. I think that the difference between the Palestinians in Palestine in the first half of the century and Donald Trump was that the Jews who were coming, who were migrating there, came well before began to come well before the Holocaust. So it wasn't always about
you said
fleeing.
16%.
Sure.
Then
sure, but the Zionist project preceded the Holocaust. Yeah. But even beyond that, their explicit aim was to create a Jewish national home. It was not to blend in, to become a part of the national enterprise, or even beyond blending in, to just be a part of a body politic. It was to take the land and create a national space there. Now, there were Jews who said, no, let's live in harmony. But that wasn't the dominant strain in the Zionist movement. And so I don't think the analogy quite bears out. It would be as if Mexicans were coming up to the United States, to California, and saying, we're going to create a small state that's separate from California here. That would invite even more anger than the sort of
idea.
Well, I'd rather that we open our border with Mexico, but that's another story.
Okay, anyway.
Wonderful. So at this part of the program, we're opening up the questions to the audience. So if you're interested in asking a question of our esteemed and expert panelists, please come down the aisles to one of the microphones. And please do keep your questions or comments brief and something that our experts can directly respond to, please.
I see some people are leaving. If there was anything that I said that made any sense to you, I'm the editor of a magazine called Tikkun, and we're going to circulate some copies. Is Ari here? Yeah, can you circulate some copies just to see it? We also send out a daily blog and information about not just Israel, but about American politics and so forth. I would so appreciate if you would give us your name and email, And when we send you something that you're not interested in, just delete it. But it would be really wonderful for us if we could know anybody here who thinks that anything I said makes sense, to give us your name and email. It doesn't cost anything, and we'll send you information, analyses of American politics, as well as Middle East politics and global politics, as well as culture and philosophy and so forth. So do you have, Ari, do you have those things to hand out?
Perfect.
Okay, so if you
Thank you.
passed it on and didn't sign up and now think, oh, maybe I would like to, please sign it with your, and when you sign, please give your email as though you were writing to an absolute idiot, because any number or any letter that can't be deciphered and we don't have your email. So please take the time to give it, make sure that any idiot could read each of those letters and numbers in your email.
Perfect.
Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. So how about we take a question from one of our audience members?
Hi. I was wondering, what do you guys think drives the support of Israel by the United States?
Should we take multiple questions so that
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Can you hear?
so in view of the time, and then we can.
Sure. So Professor Dajani just suggested taking multiple questions, and since we have very few time, so we have a question from here. How about one from the
So
other
the
side?
question was what?
What drives U.S.
What
support for
drive-
Israel?
U.S. support of Israel, and as shown in our education system and politics.
So in other words, the question is about U.S. support for Israel. Why is the U.S. in support of Israel? What's really driving that interest? And another question from over here.
My question is this was, I really enjoyed the history between both the nations, but we need to move forward from here. And it seems like we are dwelling on the history. Most of these people here are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and what we see is the conflict over there, and we see people not being able to solve the conflict. And although the history is very important, don't you think it's time to say, okay, this was the past, we're done with that, we need to move forward now? Thank you.
Great, two great and
Yeah.
questions. So would you like to field either of those questions as well?
Want to take a few more?
Take a
Or-
few more, okay, I suppose.
Hi, my question was, like, I understand that the Jewish people had an oppressed history, and but what I understand is, like, why do the Palestinians have to face the consequences of what happened with the Jewish histories, like with the Jewish people?
Great. Great.
Okay, I guess this will kind of piggyback on what was the person who spoke or asked the question a while ago, but I do have a question specifically in the context of what Rabbi Lerner has said. You kind of said a while ago that neither people are standing for peace at hand to see the humanity of each of the group, the Palestine and Israel. So my question is it possible that people in power, and that actually not the people who are living in each spaces, are the one who are not seeing the humanity of each? Is it possible that it is the people who are in power actually are the one who's not agreeing in what is, because I can't help but think about the Oslo Accord. It didn't work. It got put on 1993 and then 1995, and then Ishak Rabin was actually assassinated. So I guess I can't help but wonder, maybe it's not really the people who are living within the situation that is not agreeing, but it's actually the people in power and who has a grasp over those people who are in power that's actually not agreeing. Is it possible?
Thanks.
Very interesting. So we only have 8 minutes until
Okay.
till the end of the event, unless the theater is willing to go to extend it, which they might. But
Do you want to
Please go
try
ahead.
for it? I'd have to be reminded. Do you
I
take
do,
notes?
yeah, I did.
Do you want to tell me the issues, and I'll respond, and then you...
Sure. So, U.S. support for Israel, looking forward as opposed to dwelling on the past. Why Palestinians should be asked to face the consequences of Jewish history, and then the extent to which the inability to see our mutual humanity as a function of those in power rather than a function of the shared experience people on both sides.
Yeah.
Shall I start with
Yeah,
one
why
little
don't
thing?
you, why don't you start?
So I'd like to maybe just start with the question about looking forward for a moment. I think that there are a lot of interesting ideas about how Palestinians and Israelis might live peacefully together. I think one of the most compelling ones is something that an organization called Israeli Palestinian Creative Regional Initiatives, IPCRI, has been advancing, and it's referred to as 2 states, 1 homeland. And you can go onto YouTube and see a 10-minute sort of discussion of it, or you can go onto Issue magazine and read 250 pages about it. But what it would do is to provide for 2 states to be established where there is now only Israel, the West Bank and Gaza Strips. There'd be an Israeli state with a Jewish majority, political majority, and a Palestinian state with a Palestinian political majority. But it would render the border between Israel and Palestine border between France and Germany. And so Palestinian refugees wishing to return to the places dear to them in Palestine would be able to go and reside in what's now Israel. Jews wishing to live in the shadow of the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron would be allowed to do the same. That to me is a human solution to this very difficult conflict, but it's incredibly hard to get to. And to sort of respond to the point that was raised directly, I think that it is important to look toward the future, but it can't be without attention to our history. Indeed, one of the problems with the Oslo process, the peace process over the last number of years, was that under United States mediation, Palestinians felt asked not to dwell on history, to forget what we had experienced, to forget our displacement and dispossession, and just to look forward as though that process hadn't left us in the position that we are in right now. A good process has a role for history as well. Maybe I'll let you speak to the issue of U.S. Support for Israel and what drives it.
Well, what drives, first of all, with regard to the issue of suffering, I want to say that the argument of, well, we didn't cause the suffering, so we shouldn't be suffering from it, is an argument that I hear all the time from white men about sexism and about white people in general about racism. Hey, I didn't enslave the black people, so why do they expect me to give up some of my rights for them now? I'm not, or hey, I never oppressed a woman or a gay person or whatever. Why should they have more rights now? Well, the answer is that we have to transcend that level of thinking and think of us as part of a human community and find a way to take care of everybody in this world. And taking care of everybody in this world is going to mean, amongst other things, that Americans eventually are going to have to be willing to give up some of our wealth and power to take care of people who are starving to death on this planet. And so that principle, so I don't buy the argument, I didn't do it, therefore I have no responsibility. I think we have a responsibility to care for every person on the planet. The second point I'd make is Israel's, the support for Israel is in this country is in part a response to the recognition on the part of many, many Christians in this country that they were central to creating the suffering of the Jewish people. And there's a legitimate guilt feeling on the part of Christians about what Christianity did to the Jewish people. From my standpoint, that legitimate guilt should not then give a blank check to Israel to do what it's doing, not because the Jewish people don't deserve to be supported, they do, but don't support us by supporting an oppression of Palestinians, which actually ends up creating the foundation for global anti-Semitism. Because I think more and more people are going to end up hating the Jews the more that we get identified with a state that is obviously oppressing another people, which we shouldn't be doing. That's a key element in American support for Israel. In the 30 to 40 million people who identify themselves as Christian Zionists, way more than the Jews. Some people say, oh, well, the Jews manipulate this country. The Jews are a very small part of the population of this country, but Christian Zionists are about 5 times as many of the Jews, and they feel this way. But then there are also American interests. And what has happened over time has been that the right wing in Israel has predominated and said, we're going to support American interests blindly. Whatever America's government says is in their interests. And that has often meant supporting every crazy war that the United States has been involved in since 1948. And that has not been, so Israel is a loyal ally. Well, it's a loyal ally to the wrong people in this country. It isn't an ally to actually the best interests of the United States, of the people of the United States, but rather to the ruling elites that have controlled this country and led us into war after war, including the craziness of what we're doing in the Middle East today. So I don't know if I've answered all the points, but something.
Wonderful. So fortunately, we're at the end of our scheduled time, and we do have a brief announcement. I would just like to let you know, actually, we'll end here and show applause for our guests, and we'll also have a little bit more time to converse for those of you who have the opportunity to stay longer and potentially ask more questions.
And what's happening next? Maybe you want to tell about
exactly. And then later on this afternoon at 3:30, in W110 is also a conversation and a book signing with Rabbi Lerner. Unfortunately, Professor Dejani has to return to his duties at the McGeorge School of Law, but we will be able to converse longer with the rabbi. So I would just, with a quick announcement from Gabriela Takahashi, I believe.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say that in honor of Cesar Chavez's birthday today, the Puente Club of Sierra College is providing cake in the quad, so please help yourself to some cake.
Thank you. And so again, remember that there is a book signing at 3:30 in W110. So I hope to see you all there. And can we please give a round of applause for our esteemed and excellent panelists? Talking and answering questions if you have the time available.